Hi, everybody. This is lecture 11.1, Slavery and Prisons. In this lecture and the following lecture, Davis starts to put her ideas about the prison system into historical context. And they really are her strongest arguments for the potential abolition of prison as an institution in our society. Um, and it's very relevant. It's very relevant. We tend to talk about slavery as something that existed so long ago and is no longer relevant to our society, but it's critical to our society because the institutions that exist today were built off of the structures and the money and the resources that um, that were made possible by slavery. And just a trigger warning, this lecture includes images and terms that are incredibly racist, right? Because it is from that part in our society that was built on racism, right? You cannot enslave people based on their race and not be incredibly racist. And it is important to understand or remember this kind of history, but this does not excuse the horrific treatment of people in the past, both those terms and the use of those terms, but also by the nature of language. Sometimes we have to refer to the use of those terms. Um, yeah, just a warning if that's the kind of thing that, makes you very upset. So let's talk about slavery in prison. The very worst institutionalized racism was inflicted on those of African descent. The worst racism that existed in this country was put on people whose ancestors were from Africa. This does not imply that members of other groups have not and are not the victims of racism in the United States. It doesn't apply that people now aren't still victims of institutionalized racism. But this is why when we talk about race and racism, so often we're talking about the race and racism against black people because our society was built on that racism via the slave trade, via kidnapping people from Africa for almost 150 years. So it's relevant. It's really relevant. It's critical that we understand that, and it's critical that we understand that in its relation to the current prison system. There are some very good points throughout this book made relating to non-black racism. The first of those examples can be found on page 26 if you want to go back and just take a look at that. So Davis is making the historic connection between the prison abolition movement and the slavery abolition movement, as well as the connection between the current political prison system and slavery. And she also points out that uh, the prison abolition movement is not the first abolitionist movement. An abolitionist movement seeks to remove an institution or phenomena from society and get rid of it entirely, right? Not reform it. They didn't reform slavery. They got rid of slavery. And slavery was an institution in society that served certain purposes, namely agriculture, and we just got rid of it because it was too broken. Similarly, with lynching, we at one point in our society thought it was okay to punish people by informally hanging them and putting them to death. And that was disproportionately set up against black people, and many com- completely innocent people were killed via lynching. Similarly, with segregation, we didn't reform segregation in the South, we got rid of it. It was abolished. Davis contends that prisons also need to be abolished, and one of her major reasons for that is because she argues that they are inherently racist institutions. And if you don't think about it, if you've never thought about it, saying that something is inherently racist, it raises some eyebrows. It makes it makes that bullshit detector go off a little bit, right? But if you look at Census and Bureau of Justice statistics and compare the total U.S. population with the prison population, I mean, that's what it looks like. So this argument that prisons are inherently racist, not the people that run the prisons, mind you, but the institution of the prison, it's backed up. So on the right, we see the total U.S. population. 64.9% of the total U.S. population is white, but only 34% of the prison population is white. Let that sink in, right? We can either, we have two options here, really. We can either pretend that white people are less prone to committing crime, or that black people and Hispanic people are more likely to commit crime than white people. Um, or, and that was one option, sorry, I misphrased that a little bit, or we can acknowledge that the prison system is racist. The whole system, the judicial system, the way people are put in prison, the way the prisons are put together, that whole sector of society is racist. Um, and that's an ugly kind of thing to try to acknowledge. That's why there's so many more black people and brown people in prison, is because it's set up racist. Um, and this is really a big cornerstone for Davis's argument there. So while you're reading Davis's book, ask yourself this: are prisons inherently racist? What do you think? Um, and don't just ask, is there a racism problem? You can ask that question. If you're saying, well, there's a racism problem in the prison system, then you're arguing that prisons can be fixed. Or, on the other side of that, as Davis would argue, are prisons racist by their very nature? Is there something about deciding who's guilty, locking them up, putting it away? Is there something about that process that is inherently racist? And is racism so deeply entrenched in the prison system that it is not possible to remove racism without destroying the way prisons operate? A garbage truck is just pulled up to my house. Please let me know if that makes too much. Send me an email if that makes too much noise. I'll redo this lecture. It shouldn't be a big deal. So, historically, slavery was introduced in 1619 in the state of Virginia to help with tobacco farming. Slavery would eventually be used to farm cotton, rice, indigo, which was used for dye, as well as slavery was also used for construction and industries and manufacturing. It wasn't just farming, it wasn't just cotton, it was one of the major labor sources of the early United States. And it contributed to agriculture and other infrastructure. We would not be as powerful as we are today as a country without the money that we got via slavery, right? We built our early military on slavery. We built our early roads. We built our early factories. If you would go and stay in the South and many other places, a lot of those older buildings were built by slaves. So to say that slavery is something that happened so long ago really is to discount the suffering of millions of people. Slavery was a grotesque institution. We kidnapped millions of people from their homes, imprisoned them, forced them and their children, innocent children, to work against their will. We routinely split up families, brainwashed individuals to make them believe that they were inferior, right? Because you cannot make someone work for you for decades without making them feel like they're lesser. And we tortured and killed people who fought back. Here we have two examples. The man on the left Those are his scars from whipping that he received, torture that he received for fighting back. And on the right, we see two men modeling, if you will, one of the punishment devices that was used on slaves who wouldn't submit. Those are iron. It's an iron collar. They would not be able to take those off to sleep. They would wear those for however long the slave owner would feel it was fit for them to wear them. That would become incredibly painful very quickly. Each of those spokes is about as heavy as a crowbar. So, um, yeah, that's torture. There's no other way around it. We institutionalized torturing people in this country, and that's a cornerstone of a lot of our economics. But we did get rid of slavery. And slavery was abolished via the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln in 1862. The first modern prisons were built in the United States in the mid 1800s. Now, this sounds like the stuff of conspiracy theory. It's not conspiracy theory, it's historic context. When you are creating something new in a society, the only thing you have is other models from other things, right? Cars are based off of models that we had of horse-drawn carriages, right? A lot of those mechanics are similar. Similarly, when we were trying to figure out how to house masses of people and feed them, we, in the mid 1800s, used the prison system to try to carry that over. So slavery served as a model for prisons on how to house, feed, clothe large numbers of human beings. However, prisons were originally designed to reform the individual, to hold criminals, to make them reflect on their crimes, and to replace less formal modes of punishment, such as lynching and corporal punishment. The people that were behind forming prisons were trying to get rid of other ways of punishing people that were, in many ways worse. Uh, Prisoners, and this is a big difference, a big difference between prison and slavery. Prisoners were and are largely seen as people who were being denied their rights as people in order to punish them. Slaves were not seen as people. Slaves were seen as property. Prisoners were seen as people, and by locking them up, they were being punished. Slaves were not seen as being punished because they were property. Slaves were seen as subhuman and deserving of no rights. And that is a big distinction. It was not possible for a slave to sue his master, for a slave to demand a new court trial, as is in the prison system. But structurally, in many other ways, the prison system is like slavery. And here are some similarities between plantations and the prison system. And these were highlighted by Hirsch in his book and are also highlighted by Davis in our text. Uh, the, the prison and the plantation followed a daily routine which was specified by superiors. So you don't get to decide when you wake up. The prison decides when you wake up and when you go to bed. Subjects are dependent on others for their food, their shelter, and other essentials. You don't get to decide what you eat. You don't get to decide where you sleep. You don't get to decide what kind of underwear you get, right? And that has a dehumanizing factor to it. It isolated subjects from the general population by confining them to a fixed habitat. This is a major mode of punishment in the modern prison system, solitary confinement, which also has been found to have major negative psychological impacts on the individual. This was also a way that slaves were punished. They would basically make them sit in various types of isolating shacks effectively. And the unpleasantness of those shacks were kind of determined by the um, cruelty of the slave master. And um, also, and this is important, slavery made subjects work for less compensation than free laborers. Obviously, with slaves, they were almost never paid. But in the modern prison system, um, there are sometimes ramifications for not working. And when there aren't ramifications for not working, um, in the modern prison system, you are paid dramatically less than you would be on the outside, like 25 cents an hour, that kind of thing. Um, yeah. More similarities pointed by Hirsch. Both slaves and convicted criminals were considered to have more pronounced proclivities to crime. It was thought that slaves, if left on their own, would just go off and kill and murder people. And we think criminals are more um, prone to going off and killing and murder people, despite the fact that we've already studied in this class that criminals tend to age out of crime, right? So we think of the 60-year-old ex-con that killed somebody when they were a teenager and made a stupid teenage decision. We think of that person as being more dangerous, while in reality they might not be. Violators of prison codes, of slave codes, were often whipped, and it is not uncommon for violators of codes within prison to be physically punished by guards, right? Prisoner leasing. You can see this at the top of page 36. We effectively, um, our prisons charge corporations to use their prison labor. And this is something we explore a little bit more in the course, a little bit more in the book. There are major corporations, food corporations, telecommunications corporations, all kinds of things that use prison labor um, in order to make money. Former convicts are often denied voting. This depends from state to state, but many states, if you are convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote, and that's a big thing. That's a major denial of rights, and that may be impacting our elections, for example. And according to Davis, uh, she claims that the racism of the prison system may very well have affected the presidential election in the year 2000. And she would probably argue that recent elections have also been impacted, but that election between Bush and Gore in 2000 was particularly close. I don't know how old a lot of you are to remember that, but that was a very, very close race that came down to thousands of votes. And there are thousands of people in the United States that have been denied the right to vote through the prison system. So she makes a very good point there. Let's talk about what we mean in terms of abolition. It takes a lot to get rid of an institution, and we still, as I pointed out, suffer from the ramifications of slavery. But unjust social institutions always try to justify their existence. When we had slavery, the justification was that the agricultural sector of the economy would collapse, because if we got that, then we would lose all of the infrastructure that had been built over decades with slavery. Additionally, and that there was a certain cruel economic logic to that, but also blacks were seen as neither moral or nor intelligent enough to take care of themselves. So there's one good point and one incredibly racist bad point that we now acknowledge that now that time has passed, that was racist. But at that time, that was a very valid concern, quote unquote concern. Similarly, Within Jim Crow, that we'll talk about in our next lecture, or segregation, it's often called, the justification was that blacks are more dangerous and required more strict set of laws than white people. These were the justifications for making black people and white people use different water fountains, different movie theaters, etc. And in our lifetimes, keeping same-sex couples from getting married, opponents saw same-sex marriage as being dangerous to the institution of marriage. And until we had our Supreme Court decision to allow same-sex couples to be married, people were still making the argument and may still be making the argument in some parts of the country that that is degrading and eroding marriage. Um, we obviously see that that's not happening though. So as I said, unjust social institutions always try to justify their existence. Prisons are seen as very important to our society. And the justification that we have is that if we don't have prisons, criminals will roam the streets and attempt to kill us all. Um, and that might not be. It might be. We don't really know because we exist in a society that has prisons. We can see some get some data from societies that don't have prisons, but we could it's hard to tell until we in our society try to actually get rid of prisons. And another point, one of the final points I want to make with this lecture is that people have a very difficult time envisioning a society without the institutions that we currently have. So you can imagine a society with a king or a queen. How could we ever not have a king or a queen? Or if you look back to the Soviet Union in the 20th century, in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, well, not early 90s, they couldn't imagine their society without the Communist Party. Now we see what Russian society looks like without the Communist Party, um, and it's markedly different. And but they were not capable of having imagining that. So that's it as far as the basics as far as slavery and the prison system. If you do want to learn more about slavery, I suggest reading Roots by Alex Haley. Roots is a very good book in terms of putting slavery in context and talking about the people involved in slavery. It is a work of fiction, but is historically based. I also suggest checking out Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. It helps put into context slavery as an economic institution. And that's just part of that book. And you can actually find People's History of the United States for free online. Roots is pretty. You can find Roots for like $2 or $3 at almost any used bookstore. But that is it for this week. Not this week. For this lecture. And this conversation will continue in the lecture on Jim Crow and segregation. Bye.